All I once thought gained, I have counted lost, spent and worthless now compared to you. Knowing you, Almighty, knowing you, there is no greater pain. You're my all, you're the best. You're my joy, my righteousness, and I love you, Lord.
Leadership is the capacity to transform vision into reality. I request Dr. Ratan T. Mohanta, head of the department, to welcome the gathering.
A very good afternoon to all the participants of this very important conference webinar on a very interesting topic of the folk in theatre. First of all, I am very happy and grateful to Dr. Dhiman Bhattacharya, who is the resource person of the day, who will be speaking on this very important topic. So I am grateful to him for accepting our invite. We had been planning to do this for a long time, but because of the uncertain situation that we are in, we were not able to carry forward the entire plan much earlier. And after rescheduling it for today, finally we have been able to come online and have this very interesting webinar. So a very warm welcome to you, Dr. Dhimanji, and I'm very happy that you have come back to St. Aloysius College again. Warm welcome to you. We have with us today our dear principal, who always strives hard to take our college to greater heights. He promotes cultural events, sports, academics, all equally without giving any much importance to any one of them, but equal importance to all of them. And he's greatly interested in promoting arts, theater, culture in the college. And he's there with us today. So a very warm welcome to you, dear father. We also have with us the coordinator of Strive, Dr. Alvin Desa, my colleague, who accepted this proposal when I made it that the Department of English would be happy to organize a conference like this on folk theater, and that since we had met Dr. Dhiman earlier when we conducted the literature festival, he was very happy to promote this activity in the college today. So I welcome Dr. Alvin Desa, the Controller of Examinations, to this program. I have with me coordinators, my colleague, Mr. Manuel Souza, who is the coordinator, and along with him, assisting him, Annie Vincent, who both of them worked very hard to plan out this program right from the beginning, from scratch, to design the poster of the event and all that. So a very warm welcome to both of them, Manuel and Annie, and warm welcome to all the participants at this conference, and welcome to my own colleagues in the department who have worked hard to make this event a success. So welcome all of you. Let us look forward to a very bright and interesting conversation.
Thank you, sir, for the warm welcome. I request our principal, Reverend Dr. Praveen Martis SJ, to deliver the principal's address.
Good afternoon to all of you. Respected Dr. Dhiman Bhattacharya, respected Dr. Alvin Desa, Dr. Ratan Mohanta, my dear members of the faculty, and my dear participants. I'm very happy to be here this afternoon to the webinar on the folk in theatre colonial encounter and the idea of a genre. This is very interesting topic as India is known for diversity. We have different cultures, and there are popular cultures, and there are also the other cultures which are not so popular. I think today we are going to learn something very interesting. Dr. Deeman will definitely lead us to this interesting conversation on the folk in theater. We would like to definitely promote folk in theater in this college. Last year we had number of activities, and this year also unfortunately we're not able to have it because of COVID-19. But definitely we'll continue, and we need to be inspired by people like Dr. Deeman, and we need to really give importance to the folk in theater. I think that will definitely happen after having a wonderful discussion and deliberation today, and that will definitely enlighten our hearts and minds, and we'll also gear up to that kind of a new culture. Stride is a new scheme that St. Aloysius College has got in the last year, and we are continuing that this year also under the leadership of Dr. Alvin Desa. I'm grateful to Dr. Alvin Desa and his team for coordinating it very well. Also like to thank Dr. Ratan Mohanta, the HOD of English Department, and all the members of the faculty for organizing this webinar today. And this webinar definitely will help all of us to delve deep into this subject. I'm also grateful to Dr. Deeman for accepting our invitation, and definitely we will have a wonderful session today. Once again, I wish all of you all the best. Thank you. God bless.
Thank you, Father, for your encouraging words. Now I request Ms. Josna Susan to introduce our resource person.
Good afternoon, everyone. It is indeed an honor to introduce Dr. Deeman Bhattacharya, the resource person for today's webinar. Dr. Bhattacharya is the assistant professor in the Department of Dr. Bhattacharya is the assistant professor in the Department of Linguistic and Comparative Literature at Vishwabharati University, Bolpur since 2014. He obtained his PhD in 2017 from Jadavpur University and has also been awarded the Shastri Indo-Canadian Institute Doctoral Fellowship. He has to his credit several publications, book chapters, and translations, of which a few are Stolen Roads, Reclaiming Paths of Decolonization Through Community Theatre Practices. Chihorlata, Interweaving Speech Acts of the Dekharu and Birhor tribes of West Bengal, in the book Eco-Criticism and Environment Rethinking, Literature and Culture. Jishuku Jeevan and Christ Amarnath Jeevan, translation of Rabindranath Tagore's essay on Christ, and many more. Today, he would be talking to us on the topic, The Folk in Theatre, Colonial Encounter and the Idea of a Genre. Looking forward to have a very enriching and enlightening session with you, sir. Over to you.
Thank you so much for having me on board. I hope I'm audible. I hope I'm audible, right? Am I audible?
Yes, sir.
Okay, thank you so much. So my pranam and namaskar to all my seniors, fathers, my colleagues. I'm sure our students have also joined. Let me tell you one thing, that being on campus, that is at the campus in your campus in Bangalore, I could really get some positive vibes, and I felt that this would be a continuation of a new journey for me as a teacher, because I could so connect with the students whom I met on campus. So I would first thank you from the bottom of my heart that you're in a wonderful institution, and I consider myself extremely privileged to be part of anything that you organize in future as well, because I feel that there are lots and lots of scope there, as you have a diverse group of students. I learned during my stint at Aloysius. What I've intended to do in this maybe around 45 minutes to 1 hour talk. I wouldn't say this is a lecture because I'm not in a position to give lecture in front of senior colleagues and students who probably know much more than I do. I will share certain thoughts. This disclaimer is essential because what I am going to present is probably a very small section of my ongoing research, which is my postdoctoral research on several forms, as Father has rightly pointed out, which are probably not part of our literary canons, or not canons, or people do not know them. But that does not necessarily mean that whatever is accepted in our history books, whatever is accepted in our I would say, authoritative cultural contexts is only culture. There are certain people who are often left out in this process of history making. As I believe that I'm addressing many students here, I have tried to keep it as simple as possible because for me, as an academician and joining quite early, I would say I've realized that it becomes imperative to reach out to our young minds, which I feel that Aloysius is full of creative young men and women who would take academia ahead. I have designed it in a very simple way, though there could be very important critical conjectures which we might engage in course of time. Also, paying respect to this entire scheme of stride, I felt that probably uh, this lecture, probably this session would enable people to understand that what are the areas of history which are Sorry, can you hear me? Can you
Yes,
hear
yes.
me?
Yeah.
Okay,
Sorry
sorry.
for the interruption.
I was unmuted suddenly. It's okay. So my idea is to give a clear picture of what are the probable areas of researches that could be done. Because as I have been doing this research for quite some time, I have felt again and again the necessity, the importance of looking at culture as a point of departure to address certain very important critical questions that are raising in our present context in India. As we understand that research is a very important activity and it's a collaborative activity, I feel there are multiple ways of entering into a particular discourse. For me, that is cultural practices, because that is what I have been doing so far. Now, this background is important because I feel that the 6 slides that I have shared, which I'm going to talk about, I am trying to develop a theory, a minor theory, which is that the entire idea of folk in theater. I have deliberately tried to contest the idea of folk theater because, just like our idea of history or our idea of history of literature, in the Indian context, most of our well meaning efforts fail to address the complex interweaving patterns of any history writing. What I mean by that is, it would be oversimplification if in India we say that there is something called folk theater and we club everything under that. Once we do that, there have been efforts, there have been theoretical works, there have been cultural works, which have often tried to address this particular, I would say, point in history where it was important for us as Indians to define what is our performance tradition. Not that we did not have something. We had a long history of performance traditions. And often we think that there is a Shastra, which we often refer, the Nati Shastra, as being the sole indicator of looking at Indian performance traditions. Though we know that we have uh, we have distinct features assigned to classical and the quote unquote lokayata, lokadharmi, or the folk. I know it is very difficult to talk about thousands and thousands of years of history in a span of 45 minutes or 1 hour. It is not possible even in a year. And that is what I would want to say, that what I'm trying to do in this particular presentation is to contest the oversimplifications that we encounter in our daily life, and that probably instead of unfolding the interesting patterns of Indian cultural history, we probably create a monolith within academia for our purpose. For example, often we talk about the folk elements in Girish Karnad's theatre. I'm just giving an example. Why am I saying this? Because we have to situate a particular text by Karnad at a point of history in India. We know the time, we know the 60s and 70s, across which Karnad was actually working on these forms, trying to incorporate certain things. My critical offering would be that this was probably an approach to enter into a dialogue with the form of theater that entered the Indian scenario with colonialism. That is the colonial theater form. Not that we did not have theatrical forms, not that we did not have, I would say, regional groups, not that we did not have regional patterns, which were probably not formulated into genres, which is the second important word in my discussion today. That I am just not talking about a particular element, which is a folk, which I have really problem with, that in India. So if we say folk, then who are the other people? We are all part of the folk, I feel. So this entire nomenclature needs to be contested to delve deeper into the research that is absolutely needed in the context of cultural history of India. We have a rich heritage, and I should begin my presentation with expressing my indebtedness to a couple of people, and definitely one of them is Kapila Vatsyayanji, whom I religiously followed all my when I was growing up as a performer, when I was being trained as a performer, or when I visited, I still visit across India to learn forms. Because for me, as Indians, what we have done wrong, what we have essentially done wrong is by, I would say, compartmentalizing forms. We created gurukuls, we created a specific form so that there could be a lineage and there could be followers, not understanding that no form or no particular genre exists in isolation. There have been several contacts, not only the colonial contact, there have been several contacts within us, amongst us, in between two states, in between two linguistic cultures, and we have heavily influenced each other to form our forms. So, the first point with which I start is we probably have to rethink the idea of generic configuration or generic configuration in the Indian context. So, when we talk about Indian theater, it is almost an oxymoron, like the Indian history of literature, or maybe a history of Indian literature. That is probably not possible because of our diversity, because of our plurilingual situation. We have so many languages, we have so many cultures. Probably there could not be one folk theater or one Indian theater. There are many. So the moment we accept the multiple ramifications, once we consider the multiple contact points, it will be easier for us to generate interest in our future generation, that is our students, so that they could bank on their own identities and probably create a trajectory. This trajectory might not feed into the bigger dream of being one Indian culture, but maybe Indian cultures, many cultures, many languages, many cultures. This is my thesis. My indebtedness for this theoretical part is definitely one of my teachers, Professor Shishir Kumar Dash, whose contribution to the history of Indian literature is beyond our age, and I think ages to come, because he has probably laid a platform, he has given us a design of how there could be multiple entry points. My postdoctoral research is actually looking at the multiple entry points of identifying folk. So there could not be one Girish Karnad talking about, or we cannot have one Vijay Tendulkar, we cannot have one Rabindranath and just talk about that there are folk elements which have been incorporated by the canons and our work has not been done. Probably what these canonical figures or the literary canons were doing, or they could have done, not that they have all done it successfully, could have done was to identify the points from where we could travel across the villages in India, collect narratives, collect forms, document. So the third important point that I wanted to talk about is associated with my research is documentation. Because for me, the folk is a living tradition. It is not sealed. It is not Shakespeare's plays, which could be interpreted again and again, definitely in different forms. But it did not have a trope which had a defined space in which the performance had to be done. Now, of course, there are being several works where from India also we are looking at Shakespeare. I do not have the time actually to talk about that because I know there are many quote unquote local troops who are actually adapting Shakespeare or adapting the European classics uh, in our own way, which is again a very significant part of my research, which is reception of particular genres. So, if I can have someone assist me with the slide presentation, I can then move on to the slide. Maybe I will take half an hour to present my slide and then we can have question answers. So, can we move on to the slide, please? Hello.
Yes, sir.
Yeah.
Go to present. That's right. So this is the one, right?
Sorry, I can't see. 1 second. Yeah. Yes, this is the one. Thank you so much. Yeah, thank you so much for sharing. So, I would really like to start with a very important, mentioning a very important figure in Indian cultural history, who is Uday Shankar. I'm sure many of us are aware of Uday Shankar's contribution and definitely the experimentation that he did. This particular film, which is not a film, which is not a dance film, which is not a theater, but probably a very important historical intervention in the cultural history of India, which unfortunately many of us, many of our youth have never ever seen because the print is not available. People like us who are situated in Bengal, or if you are situated in the major cities, you might have the chance because during the Uday Shankar festival, this film is shown in Calcutta or in Delhi or in Bombay. But probably I feel that this is a very significant film. It is revived and it is now available, but the print has not been available to everyone. So unfortunately, it would be difficult for me to show the entire thing or maybe even clippings. I have tried my best. But I considered this film, Kalpana, which you all can Google, which you all can see on YouTube. I think this was the first major intervention after Rabindranath Tagore, who was actually talking about the significance of understanding the folk. It is a major lacuna in us, especially the English educated bourgeoisie, who embraced culture, who embraced the literary field, who defined what would be Indians' cultural scenario, probably failed to incorporate meaningfully the folk. The folk always came at the tangential relation to the dominant culture, which is a very significant point in my research, that why is folk considered as something which is outside the mainstream? In India, folk should have been the mainstream. We probably, who we are practitioners of theater or practitioners of culture, should have moved or should have been trained beyond the proscenium to travel across villages, to collect narratives, to observe performance traditions, to understand what Indian theater practice could be. So, this entire conjecture of folk in theater is a way of contesting what is Indian theater. And why colonial encounters? Because the colonial encounter has completely managed to document this folk. They created the folk so that they could document, because it was the imposition of a foreign culture that probably pushed aside this in the margins. So when we talk from voices for the from the margins in the Indian context, especially in the Indian performance or theatrical context, which I also encountered while I was a student, an undergraduate and a postgraduate, it was only when I moved out into the fields that I realized that probably we sitting in academia are the margins, the actual mainstream are out there. So Kalpana is a film which actually talks about imagination, about imagining a space that would integrate India. It is a very significant point because Uday Shankar absorbed all these traditions and he took it to the West with Anna Pavlova, and in 1920s he was a huge hit in Europe. But definitely people in India, except Rabindranath, people could not understand that what was Uday Shankar doing, because he was probably not formally trained in what we understand by Indian generic forms or Indian forms, classical forms, because he was continuously saying that what we say as Shastra, what we say as classical, probably has taken several elements from, I would say, the Lokayata, which is definitely mentioned in our Shastra as a Lokadharmi. But you have to understand one thing, that just because I was talking about polishing my Shastra, just about I was talking about Sanskritization, just because I was trying to elevate my culture in this entire process, long before colonization, probably we tried to ignore certain things, or probably we took certain things from the folk, quote unquote folk, in our traditions without properly acknowledging it. What happens then? Two spaces operate simultaneously. That is, the bourgeoisie who visits the theater, and of course, the non bourgeoisie, the plebeian, the lumpen proletariat who are part of the folk, but who are continuously redefining our culture, or maybe we have also borrowed from them without acknowledging. If we move on to the next slide, I will show a clipping. Probably that would give you an understanding of what is my point of departure. Yeah, can we click the link, please?
सदियों के होश में हम नाच रहे कठपुतलों से जुल्मों में खामोश से हम नाच रहे कठपुतलों से सदियों के होश में सब दिखावटी वाले बने सदियों के सपने सबसे उठ बैठे इशारों में नाच रहे कठपुतलों से हम नाच रहे कठपुतलों से सदियों की बेहोश में बंध जात पात के तारों में संस्कारों में पंथ मजहब
Thank you so much. This is just a part of the entire film, which Uday Shankar probably designed not as a film, but more than that. It is very significant that what Uday Shankar is trying to do in this is that he is continuously referring to the idea of that we have been dancing like we have been instructed to do so. So we have to understand that what was the national allegory that Uday Shankar was probably trying to look at. I would talk about this as a national allegory because we have to think of the time in which this film was being made, which is on the Indian traditions, which is probably trying to read what went wrong with us. Uh, if you ever get a chance to watch this entire quote unquote film, which is not a film for me, but is a documentation of Uday Shankar's lifelong project, which is imagining an unified India. Imagining an India with all its differences and what we have done wrong in terms of cultures. Now, it is very significant that what he was trying to continuously push was that in this entire film was that there are multiple forms in India. And it is very important that at a particular point in this film, what happens is he presents two very significant choreographies, which could be very much a part of our Abhinaya tradition from our cultural text. Two very important things which I will not be able to show today just because of the shortage of time is you go and check it in the YouTube. One is the composition on man and machine. And the second important thing is that when the artist Ananda, who finally opens his opera, which is probably modeled on Uday Shankar's thing, I would say the experiment that he was conducting in Almora. So he was talking about two very important significant space. That is how man has been transformed into a machine. This machine is because of our idea of production crept in. With the idea of production came in the idea of cultural production, where, like machine made culture, our cultures were also being manufactured with our contact, with industrialization, with the advent of the colonizers. What was happening is that our culture also became a product and it was being continuously manufactured. In this process of being manufactured, what happened is people who could not be a part of that competition, be a part of that journey, failed, lost track, and only people who were essentially part of the quote unquote mainstream were accommodated within this national allegory of what India could be. Because remember one thing, with contact, people like Uday Shankar, people like Rabindranath Tagore, they were trying probably to define what could be our Indian culture post contact. Because by then they had realized that what went wrong, not only what went wrong, what we have managed to absorb from the colonial practitioners. Here, I would say the point that I've tried to mention here is that I would now concentrate probably on three significant thinkers, practitioners with whom I am familiar and with whom I am working right now. That does not necessarily mean that I do not have respect for people who I have not mentioned. But for this brief presentation, I have chosen three important people as my case study. One being Rabindranath, as I not only because I hail from Shantiniketan and I have to talk about Rabindranath, no, but because I feel that Shantiniketan is a space which is a performance space for me, which is just not an university. It is a performance space where Rabindranath was actually performing his discontent with Europeanization of our culture. Next important person in my discourse would be Uday Shankar, which I have just mentioned. And there have been instances when Rabindranath and Uday Shankar actually had some exchanges. Prabhat Kumar Mukhopadhyay was talking about that Rabindranath was probably aware of what Uday Shankar was doing. And here comes that why Rabindranath was formulating the Sangeet Bhavana and why he was bringing several forms, not only from Indian regions, a regional parts of India, but he was also bringing Balinis, he was also bringing people from Sinhala Des, from Sri Lanka, from Japan, everyone was coming to Shantiniketan because Rabindranath was probably talking about a culture which have been deeply influenced by the Islamic traditions, by Christianity. He was deeply influenced by Christ, by Christianity. He was deeply influenced by the Mewards, by the traditions that were existing in rural Rajasthan. He was deeply influenced by the several traditions that existed in, I would say, rural Bengal also, because precisely why he that is precisely why he shifted his base from the city and he went to the rural parts of Bengal, that is Shantiniketan. Now, it is very interesting to note here that when I'm talking about these two person, I would also like to mention another very important person who is Badul Sarkar, whom we almost all know, because when we look at even Sahitya Academy's volume on modern Indian playwrights, these are the people whom we understand by who represent Indian modernity on stage. And definitely Badul Sarkar being associated with third. My major area of contestation is this, that instead of, or even without talking about third, probably Rabindranath and Uday Shankar, they were continuously in a search for an organic form. I deliberately use the organic form because it is with which I'm going to conclude my intervention. That is it then my search for folk forms, an organic quest of the body, of the Indian body, who probably had memories of the folk, but that came in contact, lost all the connections, and is again trying to revive. So, probably for me, this entire idea of the national allegory and generic configuration is a process of understanding or re-establishing the organic contact which we lost due to colonization, due to industrialization, due to our forms of education. Can we move on to the next slide, please? Yeah. So, the major case study that I want to do is on Rabindranath, that how through Rabindranath Tagore we can move into this idea of formulating how are we going to look at the folk in our theatrical practices. It is very interesting to know that Rabindranath went to the West at a very early age. He saw all the operas, he saw the various forms, he experienced the realism, the naturalism that was practiced in the West. Please note that there is a significant contribution in Rabindranath as far as our modernity of theatre is concerned, because he was continuously trying to move away from the stage of the Bhadraloks or the bourgeoisie, which was established probably in the major cities. The entire idea of the new theatre, which was nothing but the colonial form of theatre in its Indian avatar, completely failed to understand the significance of minimalism. So, the first point that I want to say here in this slide is that Rabindranath emphasizes on looking at jatra as a form. Jatra is a quote unquote, again, I will use folk so that it is easier for us to communicate, but I am definitely not comfortable with the idea of folk, and probably that is what I am trying to contest. What is folk? That is an imposition, because a folk do not exist as folk. It is for us academicians, for us people who are educated in English, for us people who do not know the specific languages in which all these are being composed. We use this monolith called folk. So it is important for us to come out of that. So why Rabindranath was talking about Jatra as a form? Because Jatra is a form which he feels that it probably criticizes the impact of naturalism and probably enhances or pays respect to the imaginative faculty of the audience. The particular essay that I am referring to is definitely Rabindranath's Rangamancha, in which he lays a design of what could be the post-contact theatre traditions in India. Why we need to go back to the Lokayato, why we need to go back to the Lokadharmi, because needless to say, the audience, the Indian audience already is trained in a kind of theatrical practice or theatre tradition. What we are doing is that the moment we are extracting them from their space and bringing it to the proscenium, probably we are losing that connect. And hence, what we need is props, elaborate stage designs, everything. These were never ever required in our Indian traditions. Presenting Kalidasa's play would never ever require the play to be staged in front of a river or actually presenting the ashrama, because the idea of ashrama is already embedded in the mind of the Indian audience through the several retelling of stories, through the Katha tradition, through the Ramayana tradition, through Yakshagana, through, for example, Nautanki, Bhavaiya, everything, all these traditions were already there in India. So we have to understand that what was the major lapse that happened, and Rabindranath was probably talking about that. Needless to say, the audience will produce meaning, and depending on the space, time, receiving culture, the meaning will vary, especially in a plurilingual situation like ours. So in Bengal, if we talk about Jatra, it is not only the predominant form, but it is also a form that probably overlooks other existing forms. So when Rabindranath is talking about Jatra, that does not necessarily mean that when we talk about the folk traditions in Bengal, we have only to concentrate on Jatra, because Jatra at a point of time has also become the canon. It has become the mainstream in Indian culture. So which means probably it does not have all the elements that a rural Bengal would have encountered 50 years back. The second important point Rabindranath uses a very important word is the idea of the stage is in the chitta of the spectator. Chitta means within the self, in the heart. It's embedded and not the physical space. This is where the structure of Shantiniketan comes in. I'm sure that our students at Aloysius will have opportunities to visit Shantiniketan campus someday and see that Rabindranath probably converted the entire campus into a performance zone where we could have open air things, where we could have multiple layers. Ordinary building could be converted into a stage, probably contesting the entire idea of the audience entering into a space designated for theatrical performances. Because in rural Bengal, or rural India, we never needed anything called the street theater, especially assigned the role of street theater, because Nukkar Natak actually existed in Burakatha in multiple forms all across India, because you just needed a couple of people like the patuas in Bengal, like the scroll painters. You just give them a space and they will start performing. So if this is our tradition, which means that people were continuously narrating stories of the myths of cultural heroes, and people understood it without lighting, without stage props, performance was out there on the street always. We did not need the influence of a Western theater to then go back to third and then look at the synthesis, which I will come. Now, Rabindranath is also criticizing stagecraft, the expenses that are associated with the idea of realism on stage. He's saying that the money the West is uh, wasting to present the slice of life, because this slice of life phrase is associated with realism, could feed many people in India. So in an economy, see, the entire project which is tried is probably talking about a kind of sustainable growth. If we are talking about a sustainable India, then it is very important for us to think about the sustenance of our artists, but just not giving them funds, but also by acknowledging them and giving them the space to continue with their traditions. Because with the death of every language, a culture dies, and that is happening in India because of this overemphasis on our monolingualism. Probably a plurilingual situation will allow us more to explore the dreams of people like Tagore, who felt that the unification of India could be possible by acknowledging the diverse forms. So each and every tradition, from its linguistic background, from its cultural background, will look at a different India. So Rabindranath is criticizing the theater practice which we have received from the West. What is significant is he is contesting the gender stereotypes as well on stage. It is very important because the fluidity, the gender fluidity that we experienced in our Indian folk traditions, it never required a woman or a man to perform a particular role that has been assigned. So these roles were interchangeable. That is precisely creating a space for gender fluidity and accommodating multiple forms of genders. I will definitely come to it when I can give an example of a particular folk form that is practiced in Bengal. It is called Alka, where there is this tradition of the chokra. Chokra means a guy who cross dresses as a woman and performs certain roles, because there is this entire tradition of men dressing up as women and performing certain roles of women, and that completely takes back to another paradigm of contesting gender on stage. So can we move on to the next slide, please? Yeah. This is a significant part. Then what went wrong? Why are we now talking about folk theater? So, which means, with which I started, that there must have been a significant difference between where the folk exists and where the theater exists. Because this is what I define as the urban dilemma, the city versus the folk. We have to understand, wherever the colonizers went, in whichever colonies they went, they gave special emphasis on developing cities, bringing people, educating people in a particular culture, so that it is easier for them for their governance. It is continuing within the post-colonial situation also. So there is always this tension of people migrating to the cities, even folk for performers migrating to the cities and becoming beggars on the roads. We often encounter all the people whom we think that they are criminals, the Bantu people, the contortionists whom we encounter on the streets, on our signal posts, are people who were rural performers who had assigned role to perform, but somehow they have lost their occupations and they're continuously migrating to the city to become criminals, because vagrancy is a crime in India. So see how the folk people, the folk artists became or were subjected to criminal activities because they could not sustain themselves. I will definitely come to it because this is precisely what the new theater has done. This is what our idea of theater has done, because this theater, the theater which I am also part of it, I should say that as a theater practitioner, I'm not a theater practitioner of rural area. My audience spend 500,000 rupees to buy tickets and watch my theater. So what am I doing? So these are the questions which are coming from my practice, my years and years of practice and training, that what have I been doing? Because probably I also have been catering to a particular audience as an artist that who have been brought up in the city, who have been well accustomed with the space of city, who have adapted plays and acted in plays which were meant for the cities. But then what happens to the modes of representations, modes of theatre practices, mode that exists in the rural space? Now, the second obvious quest could be, which we all do, let us move to the village, almost like the draconian Shakespearean comedies where everything is bad in the city. So, chalo, let us all move to the city because everything will be solved there. Hymen will come and the marriage will also be conducted, and all the comedies of Shakespeare will live happily ever after, because the city has become corrupt. So let us go and find the original folk, as per se, in the villages. Here is the problem with us. How can we expect that if we have changed so much, uh, the city has changed so much, the cityscape has changed so much, will the traditional theater remain the same? Will the traditional forms exist in the way it did 50 years back? Haven't there been contacts? Haven't we went there? Haven't the mobile towers introduced certain things within the folk communities which they might have encountered, which might they have come in contact with? So, standing in 2020, approaching 21, and with this pandemic, what are the process that we could follow to document this entire corpus of folk that has already changed? Because there has not been proper documentation. All our well-meant intended representation has been Chalo, bring some Bhavaiya performers, bring some Santhali people, bring some Nautanki people, and let them perform in the city space. They came as others. We never integrated them because we never felt that that is the mainstream. We are the city bred marginals. We never went to them. We brought them to perform for us. And it is probably late, but probably not too late from where my anxiety comes. And this presentation is that how do we look at it? Why do we as academicians, we as researchers, cultural researchers, who dream of an India which would celebrate its diversity, could use the cultural context to probably go and collect this? So what I say is that from my research, from my, I would say I learn a lot from my research fellows. I have very important researchers in my department, one working on Santhali plays, uh, uh, the Santhali space. Uh, there is another researcher who is working on the Alkap Bolan traditions of Murshidabad and Birbhum. Then I have another person who was working with me, who is still working with me on the slam poetry of Nepal and in the Nepali population in India. How language becomes a marker of identity, how generic configuration in India are continuously being contested. So, the important point that I want to make here is that it is impossible task now to identify the original folk form in the hybrid space. All our living spaces have been contaminated. Let us accept it that this contamination is what has become us. So what are the residual elements that we can think about will be the future course of research in this area? Next slide, please. So when I'm saying that Badal Sarkar's idea of the emphasis on synthesis, that is probably we need to develop a synthesis of the rural area and the city. The city should go to the rural area, learn forms, minimalize the efforts that we associate with theater practice, and probably think about the practice that exists in the rural areas, which probably I'm oversimplifying. It is not that simple, and it is not my scope to discuss Badal Sarkar in detail, but I feel it is a very important conjecture. It is a very important intervention which talks about a synthesis. So probably there has to be a synthesis of the folk, just not having one section dedicated to a folk, invoking a particular folk sentiment. For example, I invoke Ganesha, Gana, or I use a particular Javanika in the backdrop, or I use a mask, or I use a puppet, will definitely not make it organic. What I'm hinting at is the organic linkages that we probably need to establish, and that would be an ostrich-like effort if we just bring folk elements in our theater and not actually go there. So now going to the physical movement of the actors over words, simplest techniques of lighting, costuming, and staging. That is precisely what happens or what we can learn from the folk. That is a conversation. Every message could be expressed just through conversations, because a form that exists in rural India doesn't require an actor to perform an assigned role. He will just take up from a particular discussion and a performance will generate. It is very important that you all are situated in the cultural hub. This entire area of Karnataka, coastal Andhra Pradesh, Kerala, Tamil Nadu, they are the, I would say, the storehouse of knowledge systems, of cultural knowledge systems. If we think about Therikuthu, if we think about Kudiyattam, if we think about Kuthu, a storytelling tradition that exists, we have to understand that these were traditions which existed, and definitely there were several contact points as well. But what is the contribution? What can we learn from them? Is Therikuttu or is the Chakiyar Kuttu not a living tradition? The Chakyars of rural Kerala do contribute meaningfully or engage meaningfully in our present cultural context through their forms. And it is very interesting that the entire idea of connecting the stage where you have an assigned hour of theatrical experience is challenged through these rural performances where one performance, for example, Kailashuddharam, can go on for 25 days because the performer will give minute details of what Ravana is encountering when he is going to Kailash or when he is watching Kailash. It is also significant that most of the rural forms, most of the folk forms have this tendency to contest our canons, our literary canons. Because the way our epic heroes have been worshipped, there have been people within the epic also who have been ignored, like Putana, like Surpanakha. It is very interesting that all rural forms they have a soft corner for all the people whom they think have been ignored or wronged within our grand narrative of the epics. So Surpanakha is not an ugly woman. She could be a dark tribal woman who has a desire, and that desire is being contested. It has been usurped. So understand that how a theatrical space could accommodate voices of alterities. Here comes the body politics. The folk definitely at times believe in elaboration of masking the self or using certain techniques to convey certain ideas. The first thing, images that come to my mind definitely as a practitioner would be Kudiyattam. As a performer, I would definitely think about um, Kathakali, because these are traditions, these are well intended traditions which became classic. But remember that when I'm talking about Kudiyattam, who are the people, who are the Chakyars, what are the caste identities of the people who were engaging in all this? So, whenever we talk about folk in the Indian context, it is so layered. To bring that, to address that, requires probably hundreds and hundreds of researchers right now working or being appointed uh, um, uh, appointed to conduct this kind of researches. So the idea of body politics is that the theatrical space and the folk space, the idea of the body is completely different. So we have to identify the folk body. The folk body is the organic body which belongs to the soil. If you uproot it and if you just invest it in a very Western or in a very, I would say, assigned costume, that probably takes away everything from it. Because the folk forms have specific markers. The signifier and the signified are closely related with the time and space in which it is being performed. Unlike our theater experience, which starts at 7 and probably ends at 9, and we have to come out and hire an Uber and go back to our homes, and probably again think about the performance over a glass of drink or over our intellectual, I would say, discussions. No, in the folk, the continuation of the discussion is also part of the performance. So the performer and the audience is never completely different. Though there have been well-intended efforts across the world, the Verfumdung's effect, or there have been the breaking of the fourth wall, where audience are also part of this. These are all being done, but interestingly, all this existed in our Indian tradition. So then, minimalism as a practice or a way of life. Now, this is my question. If Badul Sarkar is talking about minimalism, then we have to understand that is it a practice? Is it by choice? Is it way of life? This is a very significant question which is continuously haunting me all these days because I have been heavily exposed to the folk in the last 3 4 years because I'm continuously doing this journey. I'm leaving my space, I'm leaving my theater practice and learning forms, interacting with scholars, interacting with performers to understand that what is their way of life. The way of life of a theater practitioner and the way of life of a folk practitioner are completely different because there are certain associated works, there are certain organic qualities that the performer is actually bringing from his or her everyday experiences. So he is not just performing the role of Rama or Sita. because for him or her, Sita is an organic identity or Rama is an organic identity, where this Rama could also talk about or could complain Sita about the rice which was not properly cooked. There have been instances. I have seen Mizo versions of Ramayana. There have been the multiple versions of Ramayana in the Northeast, where it is very interesting to note that how all these stories, the retellings, have the capacity of giving birth to several genres, several forms. So probably when we are saying the third, this third is probably not poor as we understand. Now, this poor I'm definitely defining or taking from Grotowskian idea of the poor theater, which I will not go into detail, but it could come in the discussion. So for me, the rural urban division does not mean that the third is the poor, because they are the rich. They are rich in culture. So when I am thinking about the poor from the Western concept and adapting that in a my Indian context, I will again go wrong, because my folk theater forms never ever required that extravaganza. It need not become more poor, because it is so rich that it did not have to become rich to become poor. So next, my next slide, please. So then what am I proposing to do when I'm talking about the folk in theater? The first thing that I'm doing to do, which I'm borrowing from Reena Tiwari's major book on space body ritual, which is an idea of decolonizing our art forms. Through colonial practices, our bodies have been colonized, our thought processes have been colonized, our theater spaces have been colonized. So what Reena Tiwari does is she's probably theorizing the ghats of Banaras, which she finds as the most significant performance zone. Many roles are being performed, death and birth happening simultaneously, people experiencing stages of life, and the entire idea of the arti that happens in the ghats. She is probably trying to theorize that it talks about caste politics, it talks about class politics, it talks about a mini India. Probably we encounter India on the ghats of Banaras. Second is theater and human struggle. Theater is always associated, always has, I feel, always associated with the organic expression of humans' desire to express laughter, remorse, whatever. It is very interesting that again I borrow this from Ngugi Wa Thiong's seminal work, Decolonizing the Mind, where he is talking about the language of African theater. Why it is significant to think about a national theater, with which I began. That is redefining the nation, the redefining the structure of a nation, the several struggles of a nation, and how do we accommodate theater practice, how do we accommodate performance within that national discourse, and what is the censorship then? With the idea of space comes the idea of censorship, because all this while the folk could have performed in a very, I would say, discrete pattern within the community. The moment you transplant it and bring it to our designated theatrical space, it will be censored. It is censored like all our performances. So how do you negotiate with this idea of censorship when we talk about the folk? Now, when I'm talking about national theater, then we probably need to historicize the form. The moment I try to historicize the form, it will again happen like our well-intended effort of creating the language schedule, that only 22, finally 32 languages have been accepted within the schedule. But there are thousands and thousands of languages and thousands of performance or folk traditions in India. So probably creating one national model will definitely not suffice. Probably we would need more regional intervention and have regional pockets who will actually contribute to the national circuit, and not have one national circuit and then distribute it, because that is never going to happen in India. Some people will get importance and some will not. In this process, a particular caste might be neglected, a particular group of people will be neglected. Now, my second point, I'm almost coming to the end of my presentation, is how do we then articulate caste class overlaps? The three forms that I've already talked about, I will come to a very important point of form, which is the Mayurbhanj Chau. when I started taking lessons in Mayurbhanj Chau, which is now a definitely established tradition, it is recognized by the Sangeet Natak Academy. There are three forms, established three forms of Chau in this eastern part of India, as we know that the Purulia Chau, where I come from, the Mayurbhanj Chau in Odisha, and definitely in Bihar and Jharkhand, we have the Saraikala Chau. But the significant point is that being Chow, these are all very different. These are all very different forms because there are also problem with the nomenclature of Chow. Some people say it is a war dance. Some people say it's part of the Chowni where the soldiers lived, so they did this. But when I started training myself in one form, that is Mayurbhanj Chow, I started exploring the heavy influence of pike nach or pike dance. As we know, the pike or the Borkandaj were the sentinels of the village. They were the protectors of the village zamindaris. So these were people who used certain techniques to protect the village. And they had conjured a form of dance, which was also a very theatrical pattern, and this became an established form within a particular area. So which means then, which was pike dance in Bihar, Jharkhand, Bengal, it multiple instances of that dance have moved into Mayurbhanj Chau. Why? Because of the migration of the caste communities. Now, it is very significant that the drum that is being used by Mayurbhanj Chau could never ever be produced in that coastal Orissa region, which means the Dome people in Bengal who are actually who have the knowledge of I would say making converting leather and then refining them and creating the drums, they must have traveled. Their dance form, their stories must have traveled. And then the Mayurbhanj Chau, which was again situated in the coastal regions, now accompanied patterns of the waves, and the rhythm came from this part of India. So, which means that the content, because they have multiple level of deus, that is the waves. They have patterns in the dance form which celebrates the body and which also celebrates the war dance and also celebrates their proximity to the sea. So the dancer, the performer, the theater practitioner has to observe the sea to understand the multiple deus and then incorporate the rhythm to make it a dance form. So if this is my fork, if this is my composite thing, then even if I say Mayurbhanj Chau as an established form, we understand the multiple interfaces which we are going to miss if we impose a form on it. That is precisely what I have tried to contest, that probably the form as we understand from our theoretical conjectures are not applicable to our folk traditions. So probably there could not be any one folk theater, or better not use folk theater just like oral literature. Probably we need to find a new pattern of thought of incorporating this and not oversimplify them, especially at this point of time when culture will become a major marker of, I would say, unifying the diversity. Now, I will end my deliberation by saying that don't think that this is just happening in India. It is happening all across. And that is where my travel comes in, because I've experienced similar things happening in North America. Whatever training I had there as part of my fellowship was, I had the experience of closely working with the Anishinaabe people in Canada, and they had their own forms of dance. When they are performing in the urban space, they are continuously trying to do away with spoken words and bringing in traditions which they call the powwow dance, their sun dance. All these were banned by the colonizers. They are reviving those forms to form their own theatrical pattern. So when they are doing Death of a Chief, we all know that which Shakespeare's play they are adopting, but none of the characters speak English. They speak Anishinaabe or they speak their local Cree language. And it is also simultaneously happening in the area where I live in Shantiniketan. There is a small theater village run by the funds given by government of India. It's called Ebong Amra. It's a Tepantor village. It's a theater village where the lower caste communities of the Bauris, the Domes, the Chamars, the Muchis, they have constructed their own, sorry, their own discourse of reinterpreting the classics. So I would thank the organizers for giving me this opportunity to share the thought, the ongoing research that I'm doing. And definitely, I would welcome questions because I could see many comments coming in. So thank you so much for giving me so much time. I hope we can have maybe 10-15 minutes for discussion, and then it's almost lunch time. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you so much, Dhiman sir, for your detailed deliberations on the folk in theatre, colonial encounters, and the idea of genre. And what you spoke about reminded me of what Carnard in the introduction to 3 plays wrote, where he speaks about Indian theatre or the Indian theatre practitioners suffering from an acute identity crisis, being torn between cultural past and the more recent colonial legacy. Carnard says, I quote, tensions between the cultural past of the country and its colonial past, between the attractions of the Western modes of thought and our own traditions, and finally, between various visions of the future that opened up once the common cause of political freedom was achieved. And I think it reminded me of what Carnard wrote in that detailed introduction. And also thank you very much for saying or talking about that folk is also as unique, at the same time as diverse as other Indian theatrical traditions have been, and whatever has been done in the name of reviving our folk traditions in the mainstream cultures, including cinema and in theatrical forms, in my opinion, is just a tokenism. They want to bring in, they want to project that we have had a rich folk theatrical tradition here. Let's have a sample of it. And I don't think there is any mainstream cultural form have taken it to the mainstream. Thank you very much. And also also you spoke about Rabindranath Tagore, Uday Shankar, and Badal Sarkar's contribution in the form of third theatre. And we will take some questions, but before we take a couple of questions, I have one of the references of Habib Tanvir here in the book Charan Das Chor Under the Place. And I would like you to elaborate on that idea because I would like to ask that as a form of question. Habib, when answering to a question asked by Anjum Katyal, says, Habib elected to shape his own theatre around the presence of folk performer, who is literally the embodiment and vehicle of oral performance culture. The folk performers are themselves endangered archives. Could you elaborate on that? I think that would be the first question I'm asking you.
Okay. Should I respond to it now?
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you so much. Like the moment I enter into this field, all the names of the friends come because Anjum being a great friend, I would say, a senior friend. Yeah. It is a very significant conjecture, I would say, when we talk about the archive, the organic archive. It is absolutely true because I said that the body is the trope of all experiment. The body is the trope of all knowledge because we embody knowledge. So as we grow up as performers, as we are being trained as performers, what we do is that we form an organic identity, which is the repository of all the knowledge systems. So what probably Habibji was trying to say is, because remember one thing, that Habibji has a particular political manifesto also in mind, because it is a very significant contribution in Indian art practice, in Indian theater practice, because we also, to answer this, probably we also need to go back to IPTA. What is the significant contribution of IPTA, the people's movement, how that is associated with theater? So theater is definitely not just for the bourgeoisie, just not an experience that you can just go and encounter, but it has to be earned, because you have to remember that the performer itself, the performer himself or herself, is carrying certain memories of cultural negotiations which she or he is bringing onto the stage. So it's not the assigned role that he's just performing, but also in that assigned role, he's probably contesting the age-old theatrical traditions which we are used to it, where it talks specifically talks about a kind of detachment from what you are doing. No, we are bringing myself. I, as a performer, I am bringing my organic identity and creating an intervention.
Okay.
So I hope I have
Yeah,
managed to respond, but
yeah,
definitely if I have more time, I will think about it and respond.
yeah, sure, sure. Thank you so much. We have time for only two questions.
Okay.
First question comes from Professor Ratan Mohanta. He's asking, do you think the bourgeoisie can bring back fluidity of gender?
Never. I am never ever hopeful of the bourgeoisie. I am here to contest my position as a bourgeois because my existence is deeply rooted in an upper middle class Bengali Bhadralok. So I always continuously have to redefine myself because I am the most privileged person. The moment I enter a village to collect a data or to document anything, I am not ashamed of myself, but I think that the first thing that I need to do is the decolonize my body because the even the water bottle, the mic that I carry is something so alien to the people whom I am documenting. So there is no hope in the bourgeoisie. No, definitely not.
Yeah.
We need to decolonize the bourgeoisie space actually. So thank you, Ratanji, for bringing that question. Yeah, because the rural Bengal or the rural parts of India I have traveled. Let me give one example. That is, when I was in Chota Udaipur, in maybe 10 kilometers from Vadodara, I saw that men walked as midwives. I was amazed that what in my culture I cannot imagine the man performing the role of a midwife. But there are certain tribal communities in Chote Udaipur where it's an assigned role. Men perform the role of midwives. They have songs, they have knowledges. So gender is absolutely fluid in rural India. We bourgeoisie who have been educated in a Western form of education have probably problematized it, and we will keep on problematizing it.
Okay, thank you so much. We have another question from Naveen Kelvin, a student of MA in English in second year. He's asking, can the thrusting of the genre upon folk theatre be extended in the academic sense as well? That is to say, the division into units and subsequent canonization done to the classic syllabus. If
Yeah.
yes, how can one endeavor to teach folk theatre in a university classroom without subjecting the plural forms with its disservice, with this disservice? Sorry.
I'm so glad. I'm always hopeful with our students. Amazing students you have. This is precisely the way I have designed my particular module on literature and the other arts. If you can write to me, I will share you the syllabi that will
Yeah.
give you an understanding and overview of how, as academician or academic practices, we can think about developing an aesthetics. The module that I've designed is aesthetics and poetics, where we start with the classics and then we deliberately create the intervention of introducing the multiple forms and then contest academic practices. So you can always write to me. In detail, I will share the syllabus, which is aligned with what you are saying. Thank you for asking that question.
Yeah. Um, since we are running short of time, Dhiman sir will not be taking more questions. Thank you very much for your detailed elaborations on folk in theatre. On behalf of the management, on behalf of the Principal Reverend Father Praveen Martis SJ, Head of the Department Ratan Tilak Mohanta, and the team of Stride and our Registrar Alvin Desa, and on behalf of all the students and the teachers of English Department, thank you so much for spending such a meaningful time with us and making us aware of the idea of colonial encounters and the idea of genre. Thank you so much.
I'm ever grateful to your team. So I hope that we will continue with this collaboration in a much more meaningful way in future as well. I really appreciate the work that you all are doing. Thank you so much.
Thank you, sir.
So I'm leaving the meeting. So can I leave the meeting?
Uh, 1 second.
Okay.
On behalf of the Department of English, I would like to thank our principal, Reverend Dr. Praveen Martis SJ, for always motivating us in our intellectual pursuits and giving us an opportunity to organize this webinar. And my heartfelt thanks to Dr. Deepan Bhattacharya for the fruitful and informative session, sir. It was indeed a pleasure listening to you. And I also thank our HOD, Dr. Ratan Tilak Mohanta, for the guidance and support. I thank Dr. Girish for moderating the Q&A session. And I would also like to extend my gratitude to Mr. Manuel Souza and Ms. Annie Vincent for coordinating the webinar. And thank you, Royal Sir, for the technical support. And I would also like to thank my colleagues for the support, and thank you all.
Yeah,
Thank you.
I just have one request because I see there are many comments in the chat section. If possible, then will it be possible for you to collate all these questions and send it to me? I will
I'll do that.
definitely, I would want to respond to each and every one
I'll do that.
because I feel that is my responsibility. I will
Yeah,
do it. You give me a week, I will respond to each and every participant. Okay.
definitely,
Thank you.
definitely.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
With that, we come to the end of the webinar. I request all the participants to fill feedback form, which has been posted in the chat box, and your certificate will be sent to your email once you have submitted the feedback form. Thank you, everyone.